Okay, so we already know that Dracula is an amazing movie, right? We don't have to go over it again. We already went over it for 20, 30 minutes? We don't need to go over it again. However, would you believe me if I told you that it got topped by its next feature that came out in the exact same year? Yeah, I kid you not. That's literally the situation we are dealing with today. Because while Dracula is amazing, Frankenstein is legendary. So we have a lot to talk about today. And please excuse the glare and stuff up here. We're doing this in the mid to late afternoon instead of the dead of night this time. So it's not going to be as dark and ominous as the Dracula review was visually. But, we're still in black and white, so we're getting some kind of atmosphere, I suppose. Anyway, let's get started. What's up? What's happening? What's going on? Everybody, welcome back to Animation Station, which is for anything and everything animation, including everything and everything monster and spooky season related. Along with TV and movies, I am your host and local horror nut, Jackson Small. Welcome back to 31 Days of Horror, Monster-Mania. And here we are at movie 2 of the Universal Monsters Pantheon, titled Frankenstein, based on the Mary Shelley novel of the exact same name. And while it technically is as loose of an adaptation as you can get, it's arguably become even more famous than the book. Because a lot goes on in this movie, and a lot changes from this movie ended up making people confused when they read the book. Yeah, it's weird how that works sometimes, isn't it? So before we even get into the review itself, and I'll try not to make it as long and lengthy as Dracula, we still have a lot to talk about, because this one has even more differences from its source material than Dracula did. Like, a bunch of paragraphs worth. Not to mention production notes and all kinds of stuff. So we have a lot to talk about. So, if you're ready, I'm ready, let's dive in. This is all the facts and trivia on 1931's Frankenstein. Here we go. There are more differences between the movie and book than there are similarities. This is because the movie is largely based on the 1920s play accredited to Peggy Webling, rather than the original Mary Shelley text. The most specific alteration is in his original experiment. Rather than the explicit rejection by Frankenstein of his creature of the novel, it is explored more exactly and directly. This tolerance of the creature as a man would largely be revoked by Universal in their later films, in which the creature was to be marketed as a specific villain and not to be emphasized on by the audience. In all Universal films, starting with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, every time the creature is referred to directly in story, he is specifically named as the Frankenstein's monster or simply the monster. However, there's a continuous misinterpretation that many people keep thinking that Frankenstein is the name of the monster, when it's not. It's the name of the guy that made it. Yeah, it's weird how that works, and it's one of the most annoying little mistranslations on all of film. And never again in story is just Frankenstein, in order to emphasize the fact that he is a manufactured being and an inherently evil one. Another notable difference between the book and the film is the articulation of the monster's speech. In Shelley's book, the creature taught himself to read with books of classic literature such as Milton's Paradise Lost. The creature learns to speak clearly in what appears in the novel as early modern English, because of the texts he has found to learn while he was in hiding. However, in the 1931 film, the creature is completely mute except for grunts and growls. However, in the 1935 sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, that we will review, don't worry, the original creature learns some basic speech but is very limited in his dialogue, speaking with rough grammar and still preferring at times to just express himself gutturally. By the third film, Son of Frankenstein, which we will also cover in its own separate review, the creature is again rendered inarticulate. In Mary Shelley's original novel, the creature's savage and destructive behavior is his conscious decision against his maltreatment and neglect because of his inhuman appearance. The whole misunderstood monster cliché. Whereas in the 1931 film adaptation states that his condition is largely due to the effect made by Frankenstein's assistant Fritz, played by Dwight Fry, who was also Renfield in Dracula, who has provided a defective brain to be used for the creature. It's different from the book, but it still makes sense in the context of the movie. The suggestion that the monster's brutal behavior was inevitable arguably dilutes the novel's social criticism depiction of developing consciousness. However, there are times, despite such a defect, the creature responds to kindness as done to him, such as the scene with Maria, the little girl at the lakeside, the most infamous scene in the entire movie, because it looks like it's a very sweet and nice interaction, and then the monster... Okay, I'm past the 5-minute mark. I think I can get away with one F-bomb. The monster fucking chucks the girl into the lake to drown and die. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that children died in these old 1930s, 40s movies, did you? The deformed hunchback assistants of the first two films are not characters from the novel. In the original text, Frankenstein creates the monster in solitude without his servants. My guess why they did that? Dwight Fry needs something to do. In the novel, how Frankenstein builds the creature is only obscurely described, references being made to a long, slow process born from a combination of new scientific principles and an ancient alchemical lore. Whereas the movies precisely depict the mythology by which their version of the monster is created, showing Frankenstein robbing graves of the recently dead and using organs and body parts to reconstruct a new human body. Obviously, they don't show stuff on screen because this was way too intense for audiences of that time period, so we'd have to wait until the Hammer remakes to get that visual gore. This process culminates with the harnessing of a lightning bolt to awaken the creature, a scene famously depicted with great spectacle in the film, and arguably the most iconic movie in the film because it has been attributed and parodied to absolute death by anything and everything, from Addams Family to Simpsons. Despite their, at best, limited presence in the original novel, the idea of the patchwork body of dead flesh and massive discharges of electricity being key to the genesis of the monster had become commonly associated with the Frankenstein story, despite being a movie creation rather than being from the novel. Again, it's interesting how many differences there are between this and its original source material. In the novel, Frankenstein's name is Victor instead of Henry. Henry is the name of Victor's best friend in the book, and he is not a doctor, but rather a college student. Elizabeth is murdered by the monster on her wedding night in the book. The monster also murders Henry and Victor's younger brother William in the book. Victor's father dies heartbroken after Elizabeth's murder, and Victor begins his pursuit of the monster, which eventually leads to his own death from an illness aboard a boat en route to the North Pole. The monster, finding Victor dead, vows to travel to the pole and commit suicide, although it is not revealed if he does so or not, leaving the book on an ambiguous note. Kind of like the ambiguous ending in Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when you think about it. Another interesting change from here to Dracula is that it actually has a much smaller cast than Dracula did. For the main characters, you have Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein in an incredible performance, Mae Clark as his wife Elizabeth, John Bowles as Victor Moritz, Boris Karloff is, of course, the monster, his most iconic role, Edward Van Sloan returning from Dracula as Dr. Waldman instead of Van Helsing, Frederick Kerr as Baron Frankenstein, the old guy, Dwight Fry as the Hunchback Fritz, in a really good performance, even if it is very brief, because he's only on the first 10-15 minutes of the movie, then he gets killed off by his own stupidity for angering the monster. And then Lionel Belmore as Herr Vogel, the Burgermeister, which, if you've seen Santa Claus is Coming to Town, you'll get that whole nomenclature. And finally, Marilyn Harris was the young little girl Maria that got chucked into the lake. But yeah, that's a really small cast. And then the rest are just background extras and villagers. It's interesting. And then production notes. It's more going over... Yeah, we'll go over it anyway. Why not? Screw it. The film begins with Edward Van Sloan stepping from behind a curtain and delivering a friendly warning before the opening credits. A scene that you should be very familiar with, because it's another scene from this movie that has been parodied and homaged to death by literally anything and everything known to man. Heck, even Simpsons used it as one of the openings to their Treehouse of Horrors. And of course, the most recent recollection of this scene and its usage was in the It 2017 Part 1 review by Nostalgia Critic, where he has Hyper Fangirl doing that and talking about how scary opinions are. And then, since she is dating this other character, which I'm not going to say his name because it's a little too vulgar for this review, but if you know him, you know him, where she then whips out a gun and tries to murder the audience. Once you see it, it makes more sense, but trust me when I say it's really funny. Probably one of my favorite versions of this iconic opening credits gag. Also, in the opening credits, speaking of, Karloff is unbilled, with only a question mark next to his name, and this is a nod to the first stage adaptation when the monster was billed only as a question mark, and also because they wanted to keep it in suspense who the monster actually was, going into the movie. Universal had not revealed in advance who was playing the monster, and had not released any pictures of the monster in order to conceal his appearance. That way, it was a genuine shocking reaction from the audience. Very Hitchcock-esque. Karloff's name is revealed in the closing credits, which otherwise duplicates the credits from the opening under the principle that a good cast is worth repeating. There was controversy around this point originally, as some part of the management of Universal built up the suspense of who was playing the creature to gather interest for the film, as Bela Lugosi was still largely thought to be performing the role of the creature up until the time of the film's release. Which is one of the most infamous parts of this movie and the Universal monsters in general, that Bela Lugosi was supposed to originally play the monster after, being a big hit in Dracula, but for very different, conflicting reasons, depending on your source, he ended up turning down the role, and he has regretted it ever since, to the point where he would later go on to play the monster himself in Ghost of Frankenstein after playing Igor in Son of Frankenstein. Again, it's a very tangled web that this Universal Monsters saga weaves. Some papers were erroneously still listing Lugosi as the performer. Some were coming to see if Lugosi had changed his mind and recanted to star in the film despite some published statements to the contrary. Most notably, the still famous Electric Beam Eyes poster, which still credits Lugosi as the monster, and showed the creature without the now famous flat head, or neck bolt makeup, created by Universal Studios makeup artist Jack Pierce. Pierce is a legend, of course, as he also created Lon Chaney's Wolfman makeup and Karloff's Mummy makeup. We'll talk about the Mummy in the next review. Others state it was because the film would cause the ruin of the performer in the role and wanted to minimize said actor's liability. For the original film went against the censor boards of the day, which resulted in some portions of the film starring actor as the monster being removed from the film. The most notable removal, that thankfully has been recovered in later releases, was the drowning scene of the little girl Maria. These removed scenes have since been restored to the film's releases as shown in the recent DVD re-releases of the original films. Bela Lugosi was originally set to star as the monster. After several disastrous makeup tests, the Dracula star left the project. Okay, that's the reason. Although this is often regarded as one of the worst decisions of Lugosi's career, in actuality, the part that Lugosi was offered was not the same character that Karloff eventually played himself. The character in the Flurry script was simply a killing machine without a touch of human interest or pathos, reportedly causing Lugosi to complain, "I'm an actor, not a scarecrow." However, the decision may not have been Lugosi's in any case, since recent evidence suggests that he was kicked off the project along with director Robert Flurry. Ironically, Lugosi would later go on to play the monster in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and the tail end of Ghost of Frankenstein. When his career was in decline and only after Lon Chaney Jr. complained bitterly about the possibility of him doing double work through trick photography to appear as both the Wolfman and the monster in the film for about the same pay rate. Chaney had already appeared as the monster in the previous Frankenstein film. So actually it was Chaney in Ghost of Frankenstein, and then it turned out to end up becoming Lugosi from Wolfman onward. Sorry, these facts sometimes get very, very confusing to keep track of. Directly succeeding Boris Karloff in the role. As was the custom at the time, only the main cast and crew were listed in the credits. Additionally, however, a number of other actors who worked on the project were or became familiar to fans of the Universal horror films. These include Frederick Kerr as the old Baron Frankenstein, Henry's father, Lionel Belmore as Herr Vogel, the Burgermeister, Marilyn Harris as Little Maria, the girl the monster accidentally kills, and Michael Mark as Ludwig, Maria's father, the one that carries her dead corpse all the way through town, in the most chilling scene in the entire movie. Jack Pierce was the makeup artist who designed the now iconic flat head look for Karloff's monster, because again, this was not from the book. Although Whale's contribution in the forms of sketches remains a controversy, and who was actually responsible for the idea of the look will probably always be a mystery. Since everyone at this point is 6 feet under. Ken Strickfaden designed the electrical effects used in the creation scene. So successful were they that such effects came to be considered an essential part of every subsequent Universal monster film involving the Frankenstein monster going forward. Accordingly, the equipment used to produce them has come to be referred to in fan circles as Strickfadens. It appears that Strickfaden managed to secure the use of at least one Tesla coil built by the then-aged Nikola Tesla himself, which explains the Tesla coil you see in the movie during the laboratory scene. According to this same source, Strickfaden, or Strickfaden, however you pronounce it, also doubled for Karloff in the electrical birth scene, as Karloff was deathly afraid of being electrocuted from the live voltage on stage. Because again, you have to remember, this was way before the days of CGI. Everything was practical. In other words, it was more believable and not so lazily half-assed. And finally, there is no musical soundtrack in the film except for the opening and closing credits. Once again, taking a page out of Dracula's book by having the silence in the actors carry a grand majority of it so it doesn't harm the atmosphere. Okay, one little sequel fact for you. Many of these subsequent films which feature Frankenstein's monster demote the creature to a robotic henchman in someone else's plots, such as in its final Universal film appearance in the deliberately farcical Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948. Another movie that we will review alongside, the other two Abbott and Costello Universal Monster movies. In that film, Lugosi's Dracula plans to dumb down the monster in order to prevent the creature from any possible resistance to Dracula by transplanting Costello's brain into the creature. Mel Brooks' comedy Young Frankenstein parodied elements of the first 3 Universal Frankenstein movies, including having Igor replaced to Igor. Trust me, I wish I had time to review it this year. It's one of the funniest movies that you will ever see in your life, right up there with Naked Gun. Within Universal's Frankenstein films, the Frankenstein creature will largely be kept in the idea of a mostly mindless monster who is always rampaging and running amok, murdering people, until the recreated Universal Films Company's 2004 film Van Helsing, where the Frankenstein creature would return to the idea of being more human. And then, of course, how can we forget? The popular 1960s TV show The Munsters depicts the family's father Herman as Frankenstein's monster, who married a vampire's daughter. The makeup for Herman is based on the makeup of Boris Karloff. And another interesting little fact is that this was not the last time that Lugosi was Dracula or that that Karloff wore the Frankenstein makeup. It was actually in a Route 66 episode. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. It was actually in a Route 66 episode from way back in the day. I'm sure it's here in trivia somewhere. We'll find it. Speaking of trivia, let's get to that trivia now that we're done with everything else. This film was banned in Kansas for its portrayal of cruelty and tended to debase morals. Yeah, this movie caused a lot of controversy back then. In other words, it was awesome because it was actually pushing the boundaries. During the early stages of pre-production on the biopic of Walk the Line, director James Mangold actually interviewed Johnny Cash, and Cash told Mangold that his favorite film was, in fact, Frankenstein. Cash explained that the idea of a gentle figure being mistaken for a monster spoke to him on a personal level, because in a way his life also kind of reflected that kind of philosophy. I'm not going to go into depth on why, because that's more about Johnny Cash rather than the actual topic of today's video. But that's really cool to learn that the late great Johnny Cash actually has Frankenstein as his favorite film. That's cool. The world's most valuable movie poster is the full-color 1931 six-sheet Frankenstein, poster, which is currently owned by Stephen Fischler, a New York poster collector, and it is the only copy known to exist of this poster. In the 1996 TV film of Doctor Who, during the mortuary regeneration scene, a mortuary assistant is shown watching this movie. More specifically, the monster's reactions to its first moments of life is paralleled in the Doctor's regeneration after he's pronounced dead. The movie is prominently featured in and a major plot element in the Spanish film The Spirit of the Beehive. The more you know, I guess. In the movie Weird Science, the movie is shown along with a similar resurrection sequence. And finally, in the 2008 film Hancock, Will Smith's character Hancock is said to have seen the movie, because, as he states himself, he woke up with nothing in his pocket but bubblegum and 2 movie tickets to Frankenstein. Which, it's a cool little detail in the movie that they actually do use in the plot quite well. Okay, and I think that's everything. Oh, right here. In 1991, yes, very long after its initial release, this film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry as being deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Yeah, that is very well deserved, because this movie is arguably even more influential and iconic than Dracula. And that's saying something. Alright, let's finish off with our review. And I promise you this review is far shorter than the one for Dracula, because we don't have to review 2 different movies this time. Don't get me wrong here, Dracula was an amazing start to both the era of sound horror movies and the Universal Monsters pantheon. But there is zero doubt that their second film, Frankenstein, eclipses it by a mile, despite coming out the exact same year. It's more than just one of the greatest horror movies ever made, it goes beyond its niche horror genre into the overall history of film itself. Again, it being into the National Film Registry, along with movies like Shrek and Gone with the Wind, yeah, it kind of speaks for itself. It's significant not just to the horror genre, but to film as a whole. From the incredible performances of the cast, especially Boris Karloff and Colin Clive especially, he steals this movie every second he's on screen, to the phenomenal set design, especially the whole laboratory, which is just, it's classic in of itself, to the mostly really strong writing, to the excellent brisk runtime. Once again, this is before they were even trying to push 2 hours back then, to especially the legendary fully practical makeup and effects done by Jack Pierce. It's all really well done from start to finish, plain simple. Yes, it is even more inaccurate to its source material than Dracula, and probably even more inaccurate than Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Has another really bizarre ending. Yeah, the movie's ending is really bizarre, where it kind of just ends with Baron Frankenstein and the Burgermeister and some maids talking about what happens at the end after what happens on the windmill, where Victor Frankenstein somehow does not die despite his entire body being thrown onto the windmill blade like a rag doll, but whatever, we can give a little bit of suspension of disbelief. And the side characters are hit or miss. Characters like Fritz and Henry's wife, great characters. Some other ones like the Burgermeister, he's kind of just there. He's not bad. No one's bad in this movie. It's just, they're very hit or miss. Some you remember way more than others. But the rest is great enough that it becomes nothing more than nitpicking. Like, this movie's iconicness speaks for itself. Overall, in conclusion, Frankenstein is a film classic. Like, if even Chucky acknowledges that, you know that you have to as well. So, yep, end of discussion. Final verdict for this movie, high and very well deserved, 11 out of 10. If you, for whatever reason, have not seen this movie yet, you need to. It is one of those movies that you absolutely need to see in your lifetime at least once to see how influential it is on film itself. Okay. Thank you guys so much for watching. That's the end of today's review. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the hype button if you so desire. We have far more spooky treats going on, because we have a ton more of these movies to review all throughout this month. So, I'll see you guys next time when we catch up with Boris Karloff yet again for his next feature, and arguably the best performance of his entire career, yes, even greater than Frankenstein, with 1932's The Mummy.